So you've heard about the A-12 and the SR-71, but there was also another member of this family that was quite interesting, and it's the one that we're going to cover today. The Fighter Interceptor variant of the A-12 was almost a thing back in the early 60s, but there was simply too many factors that led to its downfall. Stick around to see why this aircraft never entered serial production and what happened to the prototypes and the pilots who used to fly them. This plane goes Mach 3, it's faster than anything the Russians have, but it's not a spy plane, it's a fighter interceptor. The late 50s were all about supersonic aircraft. Many projects on both sides of the Iron Curtain were focused on developing fighters, bombers, and interceptors to counter the other side, with the United States Air Force just about to replace their F-106 Delta Dart with the North American XF-108 Rapier. However, developing a completely new aircraft meant a lot of money, and that's where Lockheed, more specifically the famous engineer Kelly Johnson, came up with a new idea that could change everything. The Skunk Works department of Lockheed was tasked with black projects throughout the Cold War and was already working on the A-12. This was a project financed by that shady group, the CIA, and was made to replace the U-2, eventually, with the irony being that it was actually the U-2 that outlived all other projects to this day. Anyway, Johnson figured out that his company could fulfill the Air Force requirements for a new supersonic interceptor by simply modifying the platform that they already had available, and went to the Air Force officials with the idea. They did approve the project, and it was decided for 3 prototypes to be built because it was a viable yet much cheaper option to the XF-108 program. And so the YF-12 came to life. Now, Johnson may have bit off a little bit more than he could chew. To create an interceptor out of a reconnaissance aircraft was a tricky thing, so the first task was to incorporate radar and weaponry. The nose section was slightly modified, clipping a part of the flat wing extensions to accommodate the Hughes's AN/ASG-18 radar, one developed originally for the Rapier. Along with a new powerful radar, the YF-12 was also equipped with an IRST, or more simply, an infrared sensor to track targets based on heat signatures. All the cameras and other recon equipment was scrapped to create space for a weapons bay. The new bay was split into 4 compartments, with one storing weapon control systems and the other 3 actual missiles. You see, because of the aerodynamic complexity of the aircraft, it was impossible to have missiles carried externally, or any other weaponry obviously, so the only option was an internal weapons bay. AIM-47 Falcons was the main armament selected for the YF-12, a mid to long-range missile with a warhead large enough to shoot down a Soviet bomber. There was even an option of a smaller nuclear warhead to arm to this missile as well. So not only was this fighter interceptor faster than any bomber that the Soviets could muster, it could also annihilate them as well. Talk about overkill. In total, 7 missiles were fired from the YF-12 during testing, with only one failing to hit its target. Another big change compared to the original design were fins on the underside of the fuselage and both of the engines respectively, which were to provide stabilization during the flight, much needed because the A-12 as a platform wasn't really the most steerable thing, and with the modifications done, it just got worse. It's interesting to mention that the fin in the middle was so large that it had to be folded down during takeoffs and landings, similar to what the Soviet MiG-23 had as a design choice in the future. Speaking of funny connections, there's also one between the YF-12 and the F-14 Tomcat, but we'll get to that in a minute. Before ending the design story, one more important thing to mention is that the YF-12 was a twin-seater. Apart from the pilot, there was also a weapons officer to focus on combat while the pilot would steer the already complex machine. So this plane was incredible. It was fast, it could carry nukes, and it was cheaper than the other options on the table. So what the hell happened? After the successful initial tests, the US Air Force actually signed a serial production contract with Lockheed for 93 aircraft. However, the order was cancelled shortly after because of two things. First, the war in Vietnam placed severe financial pressure on all branches of the US military, and developing new experimental aircraft wasn't the priority at the time. And the second is the fact that nuclear warfare completely changed the game. When the Soviets developed the first ICBMs based on the R-7 rocket, the rules of engagement were now completely different. Nobody needed Mark III interceptors to chase down bombers when the bombs themselves were no longer carried by planes. With the cancellation of the project, so was the dream of a fighter interceptor based on the A-12 platform. But still, this was just the beginning of the legacy it would leave behind. Apart from the further development and the use of the SR-71 in the future, it was NASA who wanted to get their hands on the YF-12 prototypes and use them for their own research. This helped them immensely because Mach 3 capable research platforms weren't something just lying around or easy to build. James Irwin, one of the initial test pilots, actually went on to build his career in NASA and became one of the few people who walked on the moon with the Apollo 15 mission. And remember that Tomcat connection? Well, the radar used on the YF-12 was in basis in developing the new radar for the F-14 down the line, and the legendary AIM-54 Phoenix missiles used by the F-14 were, you guessed it, and probably noticed thus far, based on the AIM-47 design. And a last little fun detail was the similarities in design of those stabilizing fins below the engines of the YF-12 and F-14. And the trivia doesn't end there. President Lloyd Johnson actually used the YF-12 as a cover for the inevitable questions that the A-12 and SR-71 would raise. It was demonstrated to the public and described as a new fighter to fool the KGB and hide the true purpose of the secret CIA project that was behind it, keeping the SR-71 secret for much longer. And last but not least, whatever happened to the prototypes? One of the three prototypes built was lost in an accident, with the pilots ejecting in time and surviving, but the airframe was completely destroyed. The second one was also damaged, but was partially salvaged and then used to create the only SR-71C, disguised under the name YF-12C. The third survived throughout the years, and after completing its career and service, it was moved to the US Air Force National Museum in Ohio, where you can see it today. So thank you, dear viewer, for watching yet another Found and Explained video. While many viewers might know of the SR-71 Blackbird, few know about its rival secret project, the Convair Kingfish, a spy plane that could fly at Mach 3.2 at over 90,000 feet. Convair was working on designs that could fly faster and higher than the Blackbird, beat anything that the Russians threw at it, and could even be used to deploy then undeveloped supersonic nuclear weapons. Let's jump into this Black Ops Never Built project. The SR-71 Blackbird has been hailed as an incredible machine that changed the world of international strategic reconnaissance forever. Operating deep behind enemy lines, this aircraft didn't have to worry about being shot down. It simply accelerated away from the threat at Mach 3.2 and at 85,000 feet until it reached friendly airspace. But this legendary era almost didn't happen, and back in the late 50s, the flip of a coin could have given us a very different aircraft indeed. Our story begins in 1956 with the very first deployment of the Lockheed U-2 spy plane. This aircraft would be able to fly over the Soviet territory as well as China, Vietnam and Cuba, taking photos and revealing military movements. Because the aircraft flew so high and so fast, it would be invisible to radar. Well, kind of. It turns out that while the U-2 plane was invisible to American radar, it was appearing on the better Soviet counterpart. The Russians started to monitor this plane in real time, and the US government realized that their project was over merely 6 months after overflights began. Thus, that very same year, the US started to look for an entirely new aircraft to replace the U-2 mission over Soviet airspace and truly be invisible to radar. A year later in 1957, there was a breakthrough in research when it was found that supersonic aircraft would be impossible to track on radar machines, because the dot or blip would move so fast across the screen that any operator would simply think it was static noise. Aerospace giants at the time knew that the military was looking for a new spy plane and had started to submit proposals. These designs included a new one from Lockheed called the Archangel 1, which would fly at Mach 3 for long periods of time and confuse radars, although it still had a large radar cross-section and would be visible. The Navy introduced a rubber glider that would be deployed by balloon from a submarine up to the right altitude before moving on with rockets. This design was dead as soon as it was revealed that the balloon would need to be a mile wide. And our hero of the story, Convair, offered a parasitic aircraft called the Super Hustler. Originally, Convair had been flirting with different ideas to make their B-58 Hustler bomber fly faster, including attaching rockets under the plane. So instead of a speed booster, why not carry a rocket with a camera and a pilot on board instead? They came up with a tandem wing configuration, the front stage dubbed the Baby with a camera and a single pilot with one ramjet, and there would also be an expendable stage called the Big Brother with 2 ramjets and a nuclear warhead, but I'll get to that in a moment. This concept could not only be launched from the B-58 Hustler, but also launched from the ground. For the air launch, the plane would be brought up to Mach 2 at 35,000 feet before being released under its own power. It would ignite 3 ramjets to speed up, releasing the booster as it got pushed forward. This booster section could also then be used as a weapon with a nuclear payload. By 1958, a committee had been formed called Project Gusto to choose one of these many designs. Convair had simplified the design and reduced it to a single aircraft called the First Invisible Super Hustler, or FISH. This single-stage parasitic plane, once deployed, would hit a cruise speed of Mach 4 at 75,000 feet before climbing up to 90,000 feet for active operations. Because it would be moving so fast and have such heat hitting the front of the plane, it would use space-age materials like ceramics on its leading edges, and a honeycomb structure of stainless steel inside. When it finished its mission, it would slow down when in friendly airspace and deploy 2 normal jet engines for subsonic flight. The total program cost an estimated $205 million in 1958 dollars, and these costs did not include a dedicated B-58 aircraft which was needed for the program. The committee, when reviewing this design, ran into a few issues. For one, this launching aircraft, the B-58, was cancelled in 1959, and it was unlikely that a suitable replacement aircraft could be found. The Air Force was unwilling to part with its existing bomber fleet, and it was too expensive to develop a standalone launch aircraft just for this spy plane. Plus, there were now questions range about the complexity of this multi-stage aircraft design and how the pilots would eject when connected to the bigger plane. The government asked Convair and Lockheed to return again with new designs, one that took into account these flaws and would use the newly developed Pratt & Whitney J58 turbo ramjet. For Lockheed, this involved making their aircraft have a narrower cross-section for radar, but for Convair, it would mean an entirely new aircraft. Convair would return with a non-parasitic airframe called the Kingfish. At 73 feet long and a wingspan of 60 feet, it is a rather unique looking aircraft. This plane would have two turbo ramjets hidden in the rear of the fuselage and would be able to fly up to Mach 3.2. This is slower than the original parasitic fish aircraft, but would have a longer range. When put head-to-head with the A-12, the Lockheed option was found to have a longer range, higher altitude, and a lower cost. Convair was also passed over because, unlike Lockheed's excellent proven track record with the U-2, a secret under-budget project, Convair had blown out its budget with the B-58 and lacked a secure research and development facility like the Lockheed Skunk Works. The A-12 would go on to be built and would evolve into the Blackbird SR-71. And as they say, the rest is history. Ironically, the whole plan to trick the radar operators by moving too fast ended up not working at all. The long exhaust trails of the supersonic spy planes reflected radar scans just as well as the actual aircraft and were easily seen over the radar static. Plus, future developments of radar systems made this strategy totally obsolete in less than a decade. The SR-71 would end up relying on other advantages to perform its role. And as for the Kingfish, further studies were performed and surprisingly, some to create a new version that could fly up to Mach 9. However, the invention of spy satellite technology made any future development moot. Thanks so much for watching today. I hope you enjoyed this fascinating journey of the fish in the Kingfish and what could have been. This video merely scratches the surface of the many designs that the brilliant engineers came up with way back then, and I've included a few links to other sources like Aerospace Projects Review that you can read to find out so much more. And if you enjoyed this video today, then I highly suggest you check out our Patreon, where we are offering videos early and behind the scenes and access to yours truly. Link is in the description, and thanks for watching. Flying at 70,000 feet above the world at 3 times the speed of sound, floats the future of intercontinental combat. So much so that the US Air Force called it the last manned bomber. This aviation platform was so versatile that the military planned a range of future versions, from supersonic refueling, medical evac, to even passengers. But this 1950s miracle aircraft would never enter production, and the what if only remains on paper. This is the lost future we never had, the legendary XB-70 Valkyrie Super Bomber. The 1950s and early 1960s was an era shaped by the space age and all things galactic and futuristic. It was a period of engineering projects, movies, design, and pop culture filled with feverish, sometimes outlandish dreams of the what not too distant future would look like. Flying cars, gleaming cities with highways in the sky, and human colonies on Mars and mass tourism in space. It was all possible, so it was thought, and just around the corner. The aviation industry was not immune from this excitement about its technologically perfect world with unlimited possibilities. Aircraft engineers of the time had visions of the planes of the future that could be made from composite materials never thought of before, and that could even defy the laws of physics. One just has to look back at some of the fantastical, even crazy aircraft designs proposed during this era to know it was the case. Considering this statement by analysis regarding one of the largest military aviation projects of the 1950s. Engineers hoped that one vehicle, one that they perceived as the last man bomber, could change the future of aerial bombardment. Essentially, what was intended was the bomber to beat all other bombers right out of the skies. That ill-fated plane was the XB-70 Valkyrie Super Bomber, and its many suggested variations will be the focus of today's video. So strap in, grab some popcorn, and let's get into it. The XB-70 Valkyrie was an experimental high-speed delta-wing aircraft that was developed by North American Aviation, or NAA, as part of the United States Air Force. The Air Force had first dreamt up the concept for the XB-70 in 1954, with a contract for its Air Force Weapons System 110A competition between two American aircraft manufacturers, Boeing and the NAA. It was the NAA proposal that was awarded the contract finally on December 23, 1957. The intent was for the XB-70 to be very large, very fast strategic bomber meant to replace the legendary and hugely successful Boeing bomber, the B-52. The new super bomber would need to be capable of carrying nuclear and conventional weapons. Interestingly, a key aspect of the Air Force contract was that the NAA was also the prime contractor for the weapon systems as well as the aircraft, which you may know at the time was almost unheard of. This Valkyrie would have a crew of 4, namely a pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, and defensive system operator. The XB-70 was to be 196 feet or 59.7 meters in length, and its tail stood at to a height of 31 feet or 9.4 meters. The plane would weigh at an estimated maximum gross weight of 521,000 pounds or 235 kilograms. Its delta wing spanned an impressive 105 feet or 32 meters, with a wing swept to just over 65 degrees. This plane also had 2 large vertical tails. With its engines, it could push the plane out to a decent range of 4,288 miles or 6,900 kilometers, although not a huge range, would still be considerable given the incredible cruising speed the plane could attain. Its service ceiling was also especially attractive, an incredible high altitude of 77,000 feet or 23.5 thousand meters, which equated to 14 miles or 23 kilometers up in the air. Also noteworthy and downright impressive were the plane's braking gears, which weighed more than 6 tons in total. To give an idea of just how much this aircraft had to be stopped by its braking system, consider this. A single stop for the plane would absorb the kinetic energy equivalent of that needed to suddenly stop 800 medium-sized cars traveling at a speed of 100 miles per hour, which is just ridiculous. But there were also such hopes for this super fast super bomber that many different variations regarding its potential were proposed for the XB-70 that they're worth looking into. 5 of the more interesting proposed variations of the Super Bomber included the following: a reconnaissance platform. Diagrams were revealed to show an XB-70 filled with the rotary bomb racks in its bomb bay. This proposed variant was dubbed the RSB-70, with RSB standing for Reconnaissance Strike Bomber. This version would also incorporate an integral reconnaissance camera package, which would have enabled the plane to collect bomb damage assessment imagery after it had struck its target. This configuration actually became standard on Air Force bombers, including the B-52, B-1, and B-2 a few decades later. The XB-70 would have also been a fuel-hungry aircraft, so this version of the same plane would have been used as a tanker to refuel other XB-70s during missions. The logistics of such a large air tanker refueling an equally large aircraft with their supersonic shockwaves during supersonic travel at high altitude did leave some aviation pundits thinking this version was highly improbable. It was also thought that the XB-70 could be put to use as a commercial transporter for passengers and cargo. There was even talk of a medical version that could be configured to include a nursing station along with patient beds for up to 48 wounded persons in travel. This transporter variation was actually the most practical of all of the configurations, given that the project would greatly influence various subsequent projects for supersonic commercial airliners, including Boeing Supersonic Transport and the highly popular, more successful Concorde jet. The focus here was for the XB-70 to act as a type of mothership for launching various kinds of payloads housed in modified bomb bays. It's interesting to note that the prototype diagrams indicated that various kinds of engines could be mounted to the XB-70's bomb bay, including ramjets and pulse jets for ballistic missiles. It was even later suggested that Minuteman ICBMs could be launched at high altitudes from a modified XB-70. Now, where have I seen that before? And the last and possibly most fascinating was to use this mothership concept to launch payloads into space. This was perhaps the most fanciful of all the proposed versions, but it's quite interesting to look into. These space-directed payloads included launching rockets carrying spy satellites, as well as even a manned space capsule for the Gemini program. All of these variations, none of which ever came to be, were divulged in a fascinating document called the NAA B-70 Valkyrie Variants, a future that never was. So why did it never happen? The XB-70 was full of new and experimental technologies. These included an exotic new type of boron-based fuel known colloquially as zip fuel. It was more energy dense than gasoline or jet fuel, and its advantage, so the thinking was at the time, that would offer jets greater range and speed advantages. The plane would have 6 General Electric J93GE3 turbojet engines that produced a massive 28,000 pounds of thrust each, and that would need to be burning this special fuel to attain such a blistering speed. Each of the engines would also have an afterburner, with the 6 engines located side by side in a large pod underneath the fuselage. They would be fueled by 2 large rectangular inlet ducts that provided 2-dimensional airflow and thus improved the aerodynamic efficiency of the aircraft. The plane would also feature what is being dubbed a retractable windscreen for when the plane attained Mach 3 flight. This movable screen was comprised of a windshield and ramp that would be raised during supersonic flight in order to reduce drag. The assembly would be lowered once the plane needed to land, so both the pilot and co-pilot would have a clear view of the runway. Another technological breakthrough was that even though the XB-70 was a big bird, was that it would be kept lighter thanks to an extensive use of titanium and lightweight honeycomb paneling made of stainless steel. Titanium would allow the plane to survive sustained aircraft skin temperatures ranging from 475 to 630 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 246 to 332 degrees Celsius for my non-American viewers. The high-strength honeycomb skin that sandwiched the titanium was manufactured by joining metal to metal with brazing, rather than the usual welding. That brazing technique would later become widely used throughout the aerospace industry. So you saw it here first, folks. There was even more ingenuity with the XB-70. The plane introduced an aerodynamic theory called compression lift, in which its fuselage would create a shockwave at supersonic speed. An inlet wedge at the front of the delta wings would create a disturbance during this shock wave, causing a slowing down and build-up of pressure under the wings. This would generate up to 40 pounds or 18 kilograms per square foot of additional lift when it was traveling at Mach 3. Furthermore, a third of the wing could fold down to as much as 65 degrees as to increase the directional stability and cruise efficiency, as well as sustain the shock wave at such a high speed. In effect, the B-70 was designed to ride its own shockwave, akin to how a surfer rides an ocean wave. That's quite an adventure. The first flight of the XB-70 Valkyrie finally took place on September 21st, 1964, nearly 7 years after the contract had been awarded. In attendance on that day at Air Force Plant 42 in Palmdale, California, were 5,000 employees and guests who gathered in excitement to watch the chief pilot Elvin White and US Air Force co-pilot Joseph Cotton take the graceful giant into the sky. However, the first XB-70 was quickly found to have poor directional stability above Mach 2.5. Only one flight above Mach 3 was ever attempted. NAA engineers went on to build a second version of the plane, the XB-70A. This version had an added 5 degrees of dihedral on the wings, and the immediate result was a plane with much better handling. This updated version of the XB-70 achieved Mach 3 for the first time on January 3, 1966, and would make a total of 9 Mach 3 flights by June of that very year. Unfortunately, things went terribly wrong on June 8, 1966, when a mid-air collision took place between the XB-70A and an F-104 starfighter. The accident happened during a close formation between the plane and 4 other aircraft, an F-4 Phantom, an F-5 and a T-38 Talon, in which the starfighter got caught in the massive wake of the giant plane. The pilot was killed upon impact, and one of the other pilots of the XB-70 died when the plane crashed. The other pilot on the Valkyrie was able to inject in time, although he sustained massive injuries. With a second prototype completely and utterly destroyed, there were serious doubts about the availability of the original prototype of the plane. Testing of the original XB-70 did go on, with the project even being taken over by NASA. However, studies conducted by NASA found that the huge aircraft would generate overpressures at high speed that was severely enough to shake the integrity of the plane. The studies showed that the shock waves converged when the plane made a turn, and this would double the overpressure on the ground. The XB-70 was doomed to fail. However, there were other compelling reasons why the project finally got the axe. A principal reason why the XB-70 failed was because of the fast-growing emergence of surface-to-air missile technology at the time. The Soviet Union had introduced surface-to-air missiles, or SAMs as they're known in military circles, in the late 1950s, which suddenly put the US on a back foot. This meant that the XB-70 would now have to fly low instead of high in order to evade these surface-based missiles. Unfortunately, the XB-70 offered little additional performance compared to the B-52 bomber at that altitude, which it was supposed to replace. The XB-70 was also a lot more expensive and had a far shorter range than the B-52. Intercontinental ballistic missile technology would be a further death blow to the very expensive manned bomber project, which cost roughly $700 million per prototype. This all explains why the Air Force only ever bothered to have 2 prototypes of the aircraft ever produced. The project did linger on until 1969, where it was used by NASA to conduct experimental aerospace research, but it was eventually retired. In closing, a notable achievement of the NAA XB-70 was that it remains both the largest and heaviest aircraft to ever attain and fly at Mach 3. There is also no denying that the XB-70 and XB-70A programs did much to add to what is known about supersonic flight at up to Mach 3 speeds, not to mention the incredible breakthroughs in technology and composite design due to the project. For that legacy alone, the doomed Valkyrie deserves a huge amount of respect. This is the story of an aircraft so advanced, so overkill, that it could have won the Cold War without firing a single shot. In the 1960s, Republic started a daring new project, led by ex-Russian aircraft pioneers, the same ones behind the legendary aircraft like the P-47 and F-84. And if that's not enough, it was also capable of carrying a nuclear bomb. But this aircraft would prove to be more than the US could chew, and ultimately only destroy its creators. Let's go back in time to answer the question, why did we have to wait so long for the first American operational supersonic VTOL jet? In the early 1960s, both the US Air Force and the US Navy needed a new aircraft. Gone were propeller and early jet aircraft, and supersonic was the new hotness. This study, called the Tactical Fighter Experimental Program, or called TFX for short, aimed to produce a single aircraft that could work for both branches of the armed forces. This jet would also need to be able to carry a heavy armament with fuel and feature high supersonic speed, twin engines, and 2 seats, and probably use variable geometry wings to fit onboard carriers. Unlike nowadays, with Boeing and Lockheed fighting each other for competition for the next generation fighter, back in the 1960s there were many prominent aircraft designers who sent their bids in for the program. Proposals were received from Boeing, General Dynamics, McDonnell, North American, and our hero of the story, Republic. And for Republic, a lot rode on winning this contract. Remember how I said that the US Air Force and US Navy needed new aircraft? Well, that was kinda Republic's fault. For before this contest, their last aircraft was given the call sign Thud. And you know there is a tragic redemption story behind it. This tale starts with a flashback to the man behind Republic Aviation. Alexander Karvelishvili, better known in the US as Alexander Karveli, was a Georgian-born engineer who emigrated from the Soviet Union after the fall of the Russian Empire, just like Sikorsky did, the man of helicopter fame. He first moved to France, where he graduated from the Aerospace Institute in Paris in 1927, and then moved to America to continue his career. There, he met another Georgian-born aircraft pioneer of Russian ethnicity, Alexander Savitsky, and joined his company called Savitsky Aviation Company, where he worked as the chief engineer. In 1939, the company changed the name to Republic Aviation Company, and this was just the beginning of a legendary aircraft manufacturer. They had a huge success during World War II, producing aircraft like the P-47 in huge numbers, and this is what set up Republic to be the name of the jet era. During the late 40s and 50s, they secured a massive contract with the F-84, built in the thousands. But their next big contract for the Air Force, the F-105 Thunder Chief, that marked what was the beginning of the end for the company. You see, due to several design flaws in the aircraft and the insanely high loss rates that this plane had during the Vietnam War, it was the only US aircraft ever removed from service for this reason. In fact, this aircraft was so poor that not only did it win the name Thud from pilots who flew it, but the production of the aircraft of 1,500 was cut in half by the new Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, who in turn started the TFX program to replace the ill-fated F-105. So Republic was pretty much in the corner at this point, and they needed to win the TFX to not only keep the company alive, but to win back their honor. Republic, shook by this decision, decided to go in for a chance for redemption with a new fighter and new technologies to blow away any competition in the program. And this design was to be called the AP-100. This concept featured a hybrid delta wing design that was Mach 2.3 capable. Nothing too impressive for the era, but what was crazy that this aircraft would be powered by 6 General Electric J85 turbojet engines. These were the same engines used for the F5, except there were 6 of them. 6! You might think that this is overkill, but it needed that many engines because this was no ordinary plane. It was VTOL, or vertical takeoff and landing capable, meaning it wouldn't even need a runway. The engines would provide power for 3 centrally lined lift fans during takeoff and landing, and behind them a small bomb bay that was located with one purpose only: to carry a nuclear bomb. Behind this bay was another 4th lift fan, probably used for fine adjustments during landing. The AP-100 was a single-seater, but based off drawings and artwork, there was a 2-seater variant being developed as well, to meet the design study requirements. With such a flat fuselage design, which was almost completely filled with engines and lift fans, there wasn't much space for fuel, so fuel tanks would have been located behind the cockpit in the tail section around the nuclear bomb. A somewhat great idea, but you might see in a minute how dangerous that could be. Most likely some fuel would be stored in the wings as well, and having in mind that this was to be as heavy fighter as possible, the hardpoints of the wings would carry missiles such as an AIM-9 and AIM-7 along with additional fuel tanks. But why would a fighter have to carry a nuclear bomb? With very limited space to store fuel, range of this aircraft was probably very limited as well. The idea was for it to be stationed in air bases in Europe or Turkey and have it ready for a quick strike mission on Warsaw Pact states or important Russian port cities. They may have even been used to attack amassed Soviet troops if they tried to push towards the west. And also because this jet was VTOL capable, it could also be based on aircraft carriers as well and present a threat to Soviet fleets because it could take out a whole fleet in one go. Similar to what the Soviets tried to do with the much larger bomber, the Sukhoi T-4, that we've also covered here on the channel. Flying at Mach 2.3, it would have been very hard to intercept, and unlike the Soviet Sotka, which was a bomber, it could fight back any enemy interceptors that tried to shoot it down. Drop the nuke and the mission was done. Easy. But of course, this design was very flawed. Because the wings weren't foldable, the aircraft was not really optimized for maritime operations. Also, having a nuclear bomb so far back would have moved the center of gravity, and after dropping it, the pilot would have trouble controlling the aircraft. Imagine flying a regular patrol mission with a nuclear weapon on board and having to land on an aircraft carrier in rough weather. Definitely not a good idea. Also, the TFX program required a foldable wing aircraft, and the AP-100 wasn't designed with that in mind, meaning it would take up carrier deck space. And you know this was already a huge aircraft, so the flaws kept mounting. And this is exactly why Republic further modified the platform. Their final bid to the US government had small foldable wings, which further reduced drag when flying in swept mode. It was also based on the two-seater version, and all that nuke in the back of the aircraft nonsense was thrown away. This aircraft also would no longer be VTOL capable, but it was much more solid design that could fit all the needs of both the Navy and the Air Force, but was no longer special. Upon receiving all the bids for the program, the higher-ups weren't happy because none of the submitted designs were really that great. It seemed all of them had flaws, and the engineers at the time couldn't quite iron out the issues. They had to pick the lesser evil in the end, and Boeing and General Dynamics were chosen for the second phase. In 1962, the board decided that Boeing was the winner. However, ultimately McNamara chose the General Dynamics bid due to the most parts being shared between the Navy and the Air Force's version. This led to what we know today as the F-111 Aardvark. Republic was left hanging, and this was their last project. Well, almost. Soon after all this happened, Republic tried whatever they could to survive, working with Fokker on a different aircraft, but their demise was inevitable. In 1965, only 4 years after the AP-100, the stock was bought by Fairchild and they were acquired by them. However, the engineers soon had their part in development on one of the most legendary aircraft of US Air Force history, the Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt. Because of all the hard work that the engineers had put into this design, Fairchild decided to keep the naming convention of Republic for the A-10 out of respect, and that's the legacy that Republic still lives on today. So that was the story behind the crazy but very interesting and sleek design of the Republic AP-100. I really want to know down in the comments what you think of this jet, and had it been actually built, how the US Air Force would have used it. Thanks for watching. On May 1st, 1960, the Soviets managed to shoot down the U-2 spy plane flown by Francis Gary Powers. A victory for the Soviets and an embarrassing moment for the CIA, this event pushed forward the development of one of the most insane and futuristic projects of the Cold War. drone spy planes in the 1960s. Developed to be a small unmanned version of the A-12, this drone would have been a game changer for the CIA and reconnaissance missions. But it actually ended up in the Soviet hands instead and led to the creation of America's worst nightmare. This is the black sheep of the Lockheed family, the A-12's daughter, the top secret D-21. Hey, don't forget we've got a new merch store where you can jump on and check out some cool items from our shop. Thanks for supporting the channel. The American government was taken by surprise. The fact that the Soviets were finally able to shoot down planes like the U-2 pushed the CIA and the US Air Force to come up with a new solution for spying on the vast territory of the Soviet Union. The Lockheed Skunk Works answered the call with the legendary A-12 and its subsequent variant, the SR-71, but there was still that fear of pilots being captured in the unlikely case of a shootdown somewhere over the Soviet territory. The mad lad himself, Kelly Johnson, the lead engineer behind the A-12, offered another solution to the problem, with a simple twist, removing the pilot out of the equation. No pilot, no problem. And without a pilot, this aircraft could go a heck of a lot faster. The drone was basically designed around the engine. Unlike the A-12, which had turbojet engines, the D-21 was powered by a single Marquardt RJ-41 ramjet engine with a maximum speed of Mach 3.4. René Leduc, eat your heart out. Slightly modified delta wing design was also chosen as the best one for this project, similar to the A-12, and a very flat fuselage to lower the radar cross-section. A single high-resolution camera was placed inside the so-called hatch, a small bay right behind the air intake which was waterproof and could be picked up after the mission. But let's not get ahead of ourselves just yet. As we mentioned, the main engine was a ramjet one, but ramjet engines have one major flaw. They require a high starting speed, and aircraft powered by them can't operate from the ground. Hence, the drone would have to be launched from the air. To solve this problem, the engineers took an A-12 and used it as a launch platform, giving it the designation M21, where M stands for mothership and D not for drone but for daughter, keeping the Lockheed spy business literally in the family. The remaining question is, how would the CIA put this new toy to work? It's actually pretty simple. The M21 takes off and reaches a certain altitude and speed where the ramjet engine of the D-21 can be turned on safely. It then separates from the mothership, moves on a pre-programmed path and takes pictures, gets out of the Soviet airspace to international waters and releases the camera. Then a JC-130, a modified C-130, would capture the camera parachuting down mid-air, or if that failed, a Navy ship would pick it up when it lands in the sea. Meanwhile, the drone itself would self-destruct to avoid capture by the Soviets, and risking any ramjet technology getting into their hands, burning up in the night sky somewhere over Siberia. Pretty easy, right? Well, not quite. On March 5th, 1966, the D-21 had its first launch from its mothership, and soon after they were confident for a second test, where the drone reached its operational speed and altitude of Mach 3.3 and 27,000 meters, but it was lost due to a mechanical failure. The third test flight, although partially successful, wasn't a real win because the camera hatch wasn't released and it was lost with the drone burning up in the sky. So one success and two failures, they decided to try one last time, which would be a fatal mistake. The drone detached from the mothership but didn't actually move out of the way and hit the tail section of the aircraft. At supersonic speed, the M21 was soon a ball of fire dropping into the sea, and even though the pilots managed to eject in time, one of them was unfortunately killed. This would be the last attempt with the M21 mothership, but the program was far from over. After the tragedy, Kelly Johnson proposed another solution. The problem wasn't with the drone, he said, but rather the mothership. So with yet another simple twist, he removed the problem. By modifying the B-52 to carry 2 drones on wing pylons, which was easy because of the already developed technology for cruise missiles, they now had a new mothership. But because the B-52 couldn't actually achieve the launch speed required for the ramjet to work, a solid fuel booster was added below the D-21 fuselage. Now by this point the program was kind of hacked together and the CIA wasn't really impressed and wanted to pull the plug. But the Air Force said, hey, we've spent all this money, let's at least test the concept and see how it works, stealing the program away from their CIA buddies. And the first real recon mission soon followed. During the development of all these spy technologies, the world situation had changed. China had managed to successfully test their first nuclear bomb, so the US government suddenly found itself spying in 2 places at once, and a great position to test their new aircraft. The first mission would be to spy on the Lop Nor nuclear test site, but this became a colossal failure when not only the drone lost its way, it actually flew over the border into the Soviet Union where it landed and self-destruct. I say that in air quotes and we'll come straight back to that in a minute. The second and third missions resulted in failure as well because although the route was completed successfully, the camera compartment was lost in both scenarios. The C-130 and Navy couldn't find it in the sea. The fourth and final mission in 1971 was, as you can guess, a failure with the drone crashing into China and the Chinese finding the wreck. Faced with massive international embarrassment, the program was cancelled soon after that because Nixon didn't want to upset China anymore. And by then, NASA had come knocking with a completely new concept: spy satellites. Now you could simply send up a rocket with a camera on board and get all of the footage you needed with no crazy ramjets involved. But remember that first mission that we mentioned where it crashed in the Soviet Union? Well, the Soviets came back with a little bit more than a wreck. After obtaining parts of the D-21 that failed to explode, the Tupolev Bureau, who was responsible for some of the very best Soviet aircraft, was quickly tasked with reverse engineering the drone. They came up with something called the Tupolev Voron, also powered by a ramjet RD-21 engine. The Soviets didn't have a launch platform like the M21, so their first thought was to launch the new drone with a booster from a Tu-95 or a modified bomber variant of the Tu-144. The drone would be equipped with a camera just like the D-21 and used for a single mission where the camera and equipment landed separately with a parachute upon completing the route. So pretty much completely reverse engineering the American spy drone. And just like the US, the Soviets realized that this was just too much work when you can use a satellite, and the project was abandoned before the flight testing phase could even begin. So with spy satellites all the range, the Air Force found themselves with a warehouse of D-21 drones that didn't have a mothership to fly them anymore and didn't serve any purpose. Not to waste all their efforts, the Air Force tried to turn the D-21 into a cruise missile instead with a nuclear warhead. But further developments with nuclear rocket technology led them to realize this was a dumb idea as well. Several D-21s were built and never used, and one M21 mothership also survived, where they're both displayed in a museum today. But do you know what's really funny? Is that the Chinese also have a D-21 on display in their museum, the fourth one that apparently crashed and self-destructed in China during the 1960s. So this whole drone technology never really even worked in the first place. It's just a very interesting concept and far ahead of the time proved to be just too complicated and prone to failure. However, it's a perfect topic for Found and Explained to cover today. Thanks so much for watching, and please do subscribe if you're new around here and check out many of our other videos on the channel. I made a new channel, Aviation Station, link down below. Deep under the ocean lurks a hidden terror, a submarine that the world has never seen. Its team of 9 receives its orders, a military base deep within enemy territory. The nuclear reactor spurs to life, sucking in seawater and instantly vaporizing it into a steam trail. The submarine rises to the surface, but doesn't slow down, breaching at a colossal speed with a roar that's heard leagues away. Igniting its ramjet, the submarine, now the fastest plane in the Air Force, increases beyond Mach 3. Approaching its target, it strikes with a fury not seen outside the atomic age before vanishing, back under the ocean and undetected. This insane concept is the culmination of submarine research and ramjet technology to build the ultimate nuclear deterrent. This is the terror of the seas, the unknown enemy, and fortunately, the never-built Convair submersible nuclear ramjet, or as I like to call it, the Flying Submarine. The year is 1961. USA needs an edge against the Soviets. They turn to military supplier Convair, whom at the time was looking into various applications of nuclear technology in aircraft for the US Navy. They had already proposed the very imaginative submersible seaplane submarine Hunter, and naturally had the imagination to think outside of the box. The engineers had so far thought up unmanned nuclear VTOL drones, aircraft carrier launch Mach 3 strike craft, both projects that desperately need a future video, as well as giant nuclear seaplanes, just like the Lockheed Flying Nuclear Tub that I put up last week that you can watch right here. But the US Navy wasn't satisfied. They needed something that had the deterrent capacity of a submarine, but would also be able to reach inland targets far from the ocean. After all, if you've ever seen a map of the world, much of the territory of Russia is very far from the sea, and missiles used in the era lacked the flexibility of a manned aircraft. So they needed a craft that could approach enemy territory without its presence being known and then strike quickly. This is what the team at Convair came up with. This top secret black project would be called the Submersible Nuclear Ramjet, and it would be unlike any other aircraft design of that era, and would resemble more of a manned nuclear missile than anything. It would have a long, sleek design with a diameter of 8 feet, as well as being 180 feet in length, with 2 fuel tanks, one at the front and one at the back, with 4 different exhaust areas at the rear. The ramjet would be powered by a nuclear reactor, most likely heavily shielded in the middle of the fuselage, and have vast ballast tanks throughout the fuselage to allow it to fall beneath the waterline. When underwater, it would have a sea weight of 350,000 pounds, which would then lighten up to 240,000 pounds when the tanks were empty. It would be able to carry around 20,000 pounds of nuclear-tipped weapons, 24 in total, that would be deployed with parachutes over the target area, giving time for the jet to escape and for the bomb to securely reach its target location. Remember, this is the early 1960s and self-guided missiles were still an emerging technology. Its golden color scheme, which you might have noticed is hardly stealthy like a submarine, is to help prevent the plane ripping itself apart at top speeds. Perhaps a different, darker color would have been developed, but alas, we don't know for sure. And let's talk about that speed. The jet would actually suck in water, boil it, and then eject it as steam. And I'll get to why this technology is shockingly terrible later, but this would give it a proposed speed of 100 knots underwater. This engine would be based off a special research project that looked at underwater hydrojets for torpedoes, and it's possible that the production model of this aircraft would have had a top speed up to 250 knots. While in the air, it was a completely different story. Remember how it had that full ballast tank? That would be its fuel. The pressurized water would be pushed past the 3,600 megawatt reactor, vaporizing almost instantly and essentially turning into rocket thrust. It would allow the aircraft to get up to speeds of Mach 3 to Mach 4, flying low over the surface as to avoid radar. We unfortunately don't have any range information on this aircraft, but we do know that technically, where there was water and air, there was fuel for the ramjet. The aircraft's mission would only be limited by the food of the crew on board. And this is how its mission would work. The submersible nuclear ramjet mission would be one of a quick retaliatory strike. It would be used for operations which had little or no warning, or for when the powers that deemed a deadly first strike. The crew of 9 would start their deployment by being subtly located near the territory of an enemy nation, submerged under the sea, sitting quiet. The mission profile was long and would have employed life support systems designed for the space missions. When the code red was given, the team would spring into action and pressurize the ballast tanks. These tanks would be slowly heated by the nuclear reactor, forming steam. This would then simultaneously start to be released by the aircraft, and it would rise from the ocean floor. The water would be vaporized and the jet would launch from the sea like a submarine nuclear missile today. As the aircraft rose to the sky, it would tilt over until it was facing forward and scream towards the combat zone low to the ground. The ramjet would slowly switch from water to air as the reaction mass and increase up to around Mach 4. Upon reaching the target area, the nuclear weapon would be deployed via a parachute from the top of the plane as it soared overhead, as to not impact the ramjet inlets. The nuclear bomb would slowly come to a rest on the ground before detonating. The jet, now presumably outrunning the blast and reaching safer open water, would throttle down its ramjet. It would pull into a vertical climb and then deploy special drag brakes. This would stall the aircraft and it would start to fall almost vertically tail first. Before it hit the water, however, it would use rocket jets for a rough final deacceleration, much like the SpaceX rockets that we see today. Once in the water, it would refill its tanks and descend under the waves. So if this was so incredible, whatever happened to the design? There are so many flaws with this concept that it can be hard to choose where to begin. Let's talk about the engine. This concept of a nuclear ramjet ejecting water and air all over the place would be a radiation nightmare. It would pollute the sea, the atmosphere, and leave a very clear trail as to where the submarine ended up. Clearly, the designers thought that no one would follow it, or at least hoped that the enemy would be utterly defeated until there would be any sort of retaliation. Plus, the crew themselves would be on board what can only be summed up as a radiation death trap. The shielding for the reactor wouldn't be enough, and spending months cooped up next to a reactor of that size was not a good idea. And if to add insult to injury, when the mission was complete, where would this submarine go? Would the submarine plane simply cruise around into a port and say hello, flooding the local and presumably friendly waterways with radiation? I think not. It would also be loud as heck. Like underwater, it would be the loudest thing in the world, and those in the Atlantic could easily hear it operating in the Pacific. There is no way it could hide when cruising around underwater, and even more visible when it was flying. It was not understood how this would exactly be stealthy. You might also realize that this concept sounds very similar to a later one, Project Pluto, which envisioned a flying nuclear cruise missile that once completed would dive into the deepest part of the ocean, the Marianas Trench, to protect the world from the radiation of its engine. But as Scott from Aerospace Projects Review said in his original article on this topic, the crew are very unlikely to want to sign up to a one-way trip to the darkest and deepest part of the world. By 1964, nuclear ICBMs were proved to be far more reliable, accurate, harder to stop, and didn't have pesky crew on board who might have had morals about attacking enemy cities with 24 nuclear weapons after spending long months underwater. The project was sunk. Well, as far as we know, on the USA side. But who's to say what insane technology the Russians have been working on? But that's a video for another time. In 1962, the US Navy had a submarine problem. Unknown threats under the sea that had become nuclear. The solution? The creation of a jet aircraft that could track and attack these iron beasts. An impossibly tall order. This future plane needed to be able to find the submarines fast, track them over the ocean, and believe it or not, needed to be able to hunt submarines in their own environment, underwater. Hold your breath because we're about to dive deep to explore the never-built Convair submerging seaplane. Since World War II, submarine defense had become a unique staple of wartime efforts. Nazi U-boats had hunted Allied convoys over the Atlantic Ocean, and with development of submarine-launched nuclear cruise missiles, these submarines now posed a grave threat to land-based cities. While submarine hunting boats had been effective, the age of jet engines provided additional opportunities that had yet to be explored. Perhaps a plane, with its ability to fly over vast areas of ocean, would be the ideal submarine hunter-killer. To tackle this deep water problem, the US Navy commissioned 4 different studies into the idea of a submarine attack plane, with the winner to receive a grant of $36,000 for future study, nearly $500,000 today. Let's have a look at the 4 designs that they came up with. The first design was a vertical takeoff and landing plane, or VTOL, that could submerge beneath the waves with jet engines that would pop out of each side. It was designed to be hydrodynamic, able to cruise like a torpedo, and had cute little portholes to look out the front. We can see, however, that it wouldn't have been very aerodynamic, and this design wouldn't have facilitated a very heavy payload. The second design was very different. It was a ram wing concept that had collapsible wings when it entered the water to reduce drag. It would also reduce its air intake whilst in flight and be able to deploy torpedoes out of the front of the plane whilst in the water. The third concept was actually 2-in-1, a VTOL plane with a mini submarine. The VTOL aircraft had a pretty conventional design with the submarine attached below like a typical payload. Upon coming to a rest above the surface of the ocean, the mini submarine would be deployed downwards with the crew waving goodbye. Interestingly, the concept also mentions that different mini submarines could be designed for different missions and environments, although we imagine the torpedo payload to be much smaller. But it's this fourth design that is the most interesting and would be the only one to make it past the initial concept stage. The fourth design's true name was the Convair and General Electric High Density Seaplane. High density because it would be able to go under the water itself. The plane would be 50.5 feet long, or 15.39 meters, and have a wingspan of 39 feet, or 11.88 meters. The plane would have 3 turbojet engines that would be waterproof and have the ability to seal when underwater. It would have a retractable hydroski that it would deploy for takeoffs and landings on the surface of the water, and it would have a little propeller on the underside of the tail that would allow it to move underwater. When it comes to range, we need to clarify the difference between flying and travelling under the sea. It had a range of 300 to 500 nautical miles whilst in the air, or around 926 kilometres, and a much shorter range of only 50 miles underwater, or just shy of 100 kilometres. For speed, it was capable of 225 knots, or 258 miles per hour in cruise, or around 417 kilometers per hour. So it's not as fast as a jet aircraft at all, despite having 3 turbojet engines. Underwater, it would only be able to move at a speed of around 5 knots, or 6 miles per hour or 9.26 kilometers per hour, which is actually slower than a normal person's ability to run. But before you think that this is the slowest submarine plane you have ever heard of, keep in mind that it could travel underwater for up to 10 hours before taking off and returning to base. This plane would accomplish this feat by having airtight engines, a closed-off fuel tank, and a crew compartment with an oxygen supply, with the rest of the plane flooding with water to go up to a depth of 75 feet or 22 meters below the surface of the ocean. The mission profile that was pitched by Convair went something a little bit like this. When a call went out that a submarine was near, the plane would deploy off a boat and travel to the location, rising only up to an altitude of 2,500 feet or 700 meters above sea level. This lack of height would make it quite susceptible to weather, however, it's not like it was afraid of getting wet. The plane would arrive at its location and land on the water using the hydro skis before diving below the waves. It would cruise underwater, deploying its payload up to 1,500 pounds or 450 kilograms before surfacing and flying home. Because of the weight of the weapon and the ability to stay submerged for long periods, this plane would have been the perfect ambush craft for enemy convoys, as well as the submarine hunting role. There isn't much mention beyond these specifics as to how this plane would find a submarine in the shallow depths of only 75 feet, but we admit that this was a revolutionary engineering challenge at the time. Convair would show the design publicly in 1975, and it was worked on for around about another 6 months, in partnership with the Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics and the US Navy Bureau of Weapons. However, the project seems to have sunk here and not proceeded any further than some water tests. It's hard to say the exact reason why this project never really went ahead, but seemingly this plane design was a jack of all trades, but master of none. The plane wasn't a very good plane with poor range and terrible speed. It was also a terrible boat and submarine, unable to dive deep nor go very fast. Perhaps if the engineers had been given more time and funding, they would have been able to work out all the kinks. We don't know for sure. But I admit, the idea of a plane that can sink like a James Bond car and then take off like nothing happened is an incredibly fascinating idea. An idea that unfortunately was just not possible for the powers in charge back in the 1960s. Although you can totally imagine the look of the Russians' faces if they believed that this project was truly going ahead. But this wouldn't actually be the last time that Convair would consider a submersible aircraft design. They would additionally come up with a new design called the Convair Submersible Nuclear Ramjet, but that's a design that truly deserves its own video and will have to be the part 2 of this incredible flying submarine journey. So don't forget to subscribe to tune in and find out next time. There's a new bird of prey over Vietnam, and it's unlike any other aircraft ever built before. It's a Transformer. Arriving at 500 miles per hour to the combat zone, it quickly deploys its internal rotor blades, coming to a drifting stop like a helicopter over the jungle. Teams deploy inside on a covert mission, and before the Viet Cong are wise, it's already back in friendly territory. For the US war effort in Southeast Asia, the new Lockheed Miracle helicopter plane seemed to be the game changer they desperately needed. But this great idea had a little problem of being horribly complex, heavy, and expensive. This is the incredible Lockheed Flying Car. Back at base camp, you couldn't imagine what your eyes were seeing. For one, this new aircraft had a large tri-bladed rotor on top of capable of heavy lifting and hovering over the battlefield. But it gets better. These rotors had the ability to fold away and reach speeds a helicopter could only dream of. The rear had a door on each side that could be opened for rescue teams on the ground and to provide light arms fire if needed, with a tail rotor at the end to give it the maneuverability of a helicopter when it was hovering. With range and speed on its side, the Lockheed car could fly into battle, perform its mission, and zip out before the enemy was even the wiser. And you're probably wondering, why on earth did the US Army even need this insane thing? Well, it was to solve the issue of losing pilots to the enemy. Now, I don't mean killed in action, but rather saving pilots who bailed out after losing the fight in the sky, and preventing their capture by the opponent's ground forces. While a typical fighter jet can cost millions of dollars, it was even more expensive to train up a replacement pilot and have them sit around in a prisoner of war camp, or God forbid, be executed. It was definitely not an appeasing thought for the US military. And thus, the US Army needed a solution to this tricky problem. An aircraft that could rapidly arrive to a downed pilot in the middle of the jungle, then land or deploy a rescue team without a runway, and then bug out before the Viet Cong arrived. And it would need to fly like a jet, but hover like the helicopter. So in typical fashion, the US Army put out a competition called CAR, either dubbed the Combat Aircrew Rescue Aircraft or the Composite Aircraft Retractable Rotor Program, depending on who you ask, and invited the usual aerospace firms to design such an aircraft. In the stowed rotor concept, the aircraft takes off vertically as a helicopter and during transition gradually shifts the load from the rotor to the wing. Speed greater than the stall speed of the wing, the rotor is completely unloaded, stopped and then folded and retracted and covered with fairings to convert to the airplane configuration. With this concept in mind, and it being the 1960s, the various firms came back with some very interesting designs indeed. Sikorsky was one of the first to submit a proposal for an aircraft that could fly up to 400 knots, a good 250 knots more than the Army's current helicopters operating in Vietnam. They also came up with another concept called the XV-2 that had an asymmetrical retractable rotor, something that I've never seen before. Let me know in the comments if you want me to do a full video on it. Then there was also the North American Aviation concept, who would work with Sikorsky to develop a plane that had helicopter blades on top, with themselves providing the jet aircraft features. Piasecki was quick to follow up with the PH-51 and PH-55 that both featured a retractable rotor on top of the aircraft. Interestingly, the PH-51 didn't actually feature a tail plane, but two smaller tails to give the larger rotor diameter. Marchetti Laffer was next to the table with what looks like a Boeing 727 with helicopter blades, but these ones were actually telescopic as well as retracting. Marchetti would also be developing a stoppable rotor that could also double as a wing, but that's a story for another time, so be sure to subscribe. But our hero of the story, Lockheed, was the most successful. High off the fumes with whatever they were smoking in the 60s, I mean, just look at some of these designs, they came up with some very unique helicopter concepts that could do the job. Called the CL-945 stowed rotor aircraft, Lockheed would actually propose 3 different versions. The first proposal was the CL-945-1 that had a main rotor on top, a pusher prop on the end of the tail for horizontal flight, and then a tail rotor stolen from the AH-56 Cheyenne. This one didn't actually retract the blades, but just let them naturally fold back at the aircraft when it got up to a faster and faster speed. Lockheed knew that this wasn't the optimal design, and it's rare that the first version is ever accepted, so they went back to the drawing board to come up with a double variant on the second proposal. The CL-945-2 made the leap to store the rotor blades when the aircraft got up to flight, reducing the drag when at speed. The rear prop was dropped in favor for either prop engines suspended under each wing or turbofans for jet propulsion, which would have seriously increased its power. And just how fast did Lockheed think this would go? Up to 800 kilometers per hour, or just shy of 500 miles per hour. That's triple the speed of the helicopter that the military was fielding at the time. It would have 2 crew members and a side door that search and rescue teams could rappel from to enter the jungle. Lockheed also had several extra options to add to the aircraft. A rear loading ramp for one that could be used when it arrived at the scene and needed to land to deploy troops or transport cargo. There was also the option to sling cargo loads under the aircraft, able to carry a light troop carrier. Now, I have my doubts about this one as the carrying weight of this aircraft was light, but I'll get to that in a moment. There was also a proposal to add guns and missiles to the thing to turn it into a gunship, but as Lockheed was also developing the Cheyenne at the same time, this would have been a direct competitor, and I think they really didn't push it. The concept was also shopped to the Navy, and a few mock-ups were done in Navy livery. But we have few and far between the details of what this would have entailed, but like the planned operations of the Jungle, it would have seen great use as a rescue aircraft on board an aircraft carrier. But Lockheed wasn't just satisfied for military applications for the Army and Navy, but also suggested that it would have civil applications of this aircraft as well. They would rename the CL-954 the Lockheed Air Commuter, and they believed that with the right configuration, they could carry anywhere from 60 to 120 passengers between various cities along the US coast. At that top speed of 500 miles per hour, this would easily find a market in northeastern USA between the cities of New York, Boston, and Washington, D.C. Lastly, Lockheed would expand this concept over to the CL-1060, a proposal for a sky crane helicopter that could also carry 20 tons or 150 passengers as part of their larger commuter helicopter dreams. It seems Lockheed was onto a winner and the military was excited. So what happened? The military was impressed enough to grant further funding to Lockheed, who would go on to work with NASA to develop small-scale tests, using a 40 by 80 foot wind tunnel. They managed to get the stowed rotor to start, stop and fold, working with their rigid motor at speeds up to 140 knots. Shy of the 400 knots promised before, but still significantly fast. But there were some teething issues. The first was the weight. A retractable system like this is super heavy and would have penalized the aircraft's carrying capacity. It wouldn't have been able to carry much, and the sling concept was laughable. You see, Lockheed believed that this would have a carrying capacity of 31,000 pounds, but that's still not very much to the Chinook's capacity of 50,000 pounds. Secondly, any retracting system was incredibly complex and prone to malfunction, and this was the pinnacle of over-the-top engineering. It took up a ton of space on the aircraft, and if it broke down, the aircraft would be grounded. A normal helicopter didn't have to deploy its rotors to fly, and therefore skip this stage entirely. By 1967, NASA recommended further engineering work, relying less on new technology, but ingenuity and inventiveness to make this concept work, with an eventual prototype or research vehicle to test the concept. Alas, it seems that this never happened, and the military moved on to VTOL jets and tilt-rotor aircraft like the V-22, and the stowed rotor aircraft concept never eventuated, although we did see it appear in a half-decent Arnold Schwarzenegger film decades later, so perhaps good ideas always find their way back. In typical Cold War fashion, this concept was also replicated on the other side of the Iron Curtain in the USSR. Russia actually came up with 2 versions of this idea of a plane helicopter that even had a large turret on the bottom. A whole video that you can watch right now on the channel. This video is sponsored by me. Check out my new channel, Aviation Station, with the link below. Niagara Falls, 30th of November, 1962. The future of air travel is here. The exciting new concept aircraft dubbed the X-22 is revealed to the world. It had 4 ducted fans, could carry 8, and fly vertically. But the military saw a better use for this design. Under heavy fire, this VTOL aircraft would have changed Navy operations, Marine deployment, and through civil application, the way we commute around the world. Its ability to fly, compact design, and stable flight dubbed it the perfect blend of helicopter and plane. But it would never enter production. This is the story of the Bell X-22. In the early 60s, there were several studies in creating the first mass-produced VTOL aircraft, a plane that could operate like a jet and then at the same time land vertically where needed. The Air Force had experimented with the CL-346 in the 1950s, but as one commentator pointed out in this video of mine, it would have burned the deck of the aircraft carrier with its jets when landing if it was actually deployed by the Navy. Thus, a true VTOL design would be needed for practical application in all three branches of the US military: the Air Force, Navy, and Army. This project would be called the Tri-Service VTOL Transport Program and would address the needs of all three. The main goal of this program was to develop a small number of prototype VTOL transport aircraft that would use different concepts and to perform operational evaluations of their usefulness. Some of the other requirements were that this VTOL design would need to fit on board carriers and try not to have any complex wing folding mechanisms. Bell, who had been exploring such designs throughout the 1950s, had promising leads with ducted fans. These were rotors that were still open to the elements, but had the ability to operate like jet engines. They had designed an aircraft called the D-190 Sea Air Rescue Utility Aircraft for the Air Force that could even be carried under the fuselage of a Lockheed C-130 Hercules. It had 2 duct fans and had a surprising number of applications in the real world. However, during that development, engineers discovered that a dual tandem ducted fan configuration, that is 4 ducted fans, allowed a shorter wingspan and thus a lighter and smaller design to work. This led to the design D-2022, called the US Marines VTOL Assault Transport System, able to carry 30 armed troops into battle. But this project and its earlier version didn't really get past wind tunnel tests. Entering into the 1960s, the US military needed to pull the trigger and select a design to move ahead with for the Tri-Service Transport Aircraft project. The tilt-wing Vought XC-142A would win this contest, just beating the Bell & Lockheed D-2064. But the committee was so impressed with the Bell & Lockheed design that they were given a $27 million contract, which is $250 million today, to bring it to life. Internally, they called this new version the exciting name of the model D-2127, but it was quickly dubbed the X-22 program. And this is what it was like. The Bell X-22A had something of a boxy fuselage that was 39.7 feet long and a wingspan of 39 feet wide, although its front wing was only 23 feet wide to allow the 2 different sets of rotors to not interfere with one another, and the whole aircraft was only 20 feet tall. This smaller stature allowed it to fit within hangars and ships without any folding wings, and as it was so small, it only had a maximum takeoff weight of around 8,000 kilograms, or 17,500 pounds, with its 4 GE turboshaft engines providing 1,267 horsepower or 945 kilowatts each powering a different propeller that was 7 foot wide or 2.13 meters. These tilted duct fans were the magic of the design. They would be able to rotate completely to allow the aircraft to lift off from the ground vertically and then turn horizontally to allow the plane, if I can call it that, to fly horizontally at some speed. By having 4 fans instead of just 2, there would also be a large pitch trim and control forces, giving the aircraft precise control in hover and transition modes, something that had plagued many VTOL designs before. This plane would also be safe, with each engine powering a different fan, and thus if one got knocked out, the aircraft could still fly, although it'd be quite underpowered. These propellers would be able to take the aircraft up to a top speed of 221 knots, which is 254 miles per hour or 409 kilometers per hour, but it only had a range of 387 nautical miles, which is around 716 kilometers, so hardly the range or speed we commonly discuss on this channel with some of our more ridiculous designs, but compared to the range and speed of a typical helicopter today, say for example the Bell 206 Long Ranger, it's around double the speed and comparatively the same range. It would also have a service ceiling of around 27.8 thousand feet or 8,500 meters, meaning the cabin would require some pressurization to keep the crew and passengers in comfort. Speaking of, its size didn't exactly afford a lot of internal space, so it could only carry a crew of 2 and have 6 passengers on board. But this was only the beginning. Bell actually planned other versions of this aircraft, such as an attack military version. Bell fully intended for this design to be the beginnings of a whole new lineup of military and civil aircraft. We know that there were at least 10 other variants proposed, and while we don't have all the information on all of them, here is the highlight reel. An enlarged development of the X-22 for cargo operations with a rear ramp. A ducted fan large transport aircraft using the same fan configuration for marine deployment. A ducted fan very large transport aircraft known as the Model 2240 for military operations under fire. Armed X-222A proposal with 2 trainable gun pods, an offset underside turret, and a single deployable rocket pod. A United States Air Force Tactical Air Command VTOL aircraft with a wholly new tandem cockpit and bombs that it could drop on enemy positions. And another version with guns but also missile racks. Pew pew! And a special Navy search and rescue version. And lastly, apparently there was also one that could launch torpedoes, giving the Convair submersible seaplane a run for its money. By 1963, Bell had conducted many tests in wind tunnels with up to 8 separate scale models, including a completely full-sized one, to test the ducted air fans. But the main show came by 1966 with the first of 2 X-22A test aircraft rolled out onto the runway. It performed a test flight for 10 minutes and quickly performed 4 vertical takeoffs and landings, as well as a few 180-degree turns. It was hailed as a success, and the team quickly rolled out additional tests to log as many flight hours as possible. Alas, that would not be the case, and after 3.2 hours of flying, the impossible happened. The fuselage broke in half when testing an emergency landing, and the supposedly fail-safe system failed at the same time. It turned out that the hydraulic tubes that carried the oil for the 4 different engines had failed due to excessive vibration. No one was hurt, but it set the program back until the second and last prototype could be brought up to speed. It would be 1 year later when the second prototype took to the sky, and this one would operate for the Tri-Forces for many years as a test aircraft, logging 229 flights or 125 flight hours. It did 3 major tests with the 3 branches of the military, with their pilots and engineers looking over the aircraft. It was praised as the aircraft that was easier to control than a plane, more stable than a helicopter in hover mode, and could very well be the future of air travel as we know it. So if it was so great, why was it never put into production? In 1968, the X-22 was deemed most useful for the US Navy, who then took over the project for further testing. And by further testing, I mean a good, solid 15 years of tests. That's right, they put it on the back burner where the single prototype would be tested until 1984, operating countless flying hours and landings, all while still seeking that elusive production contract. In the autumn of 1984, the program was finally cancelled as interest in VTOL technology had faded and the testing team disbanded. The engineers sought more funding, if anything, to keep the program alive, but all they could get was a few training operations for Navy test pilot schools. The Navy then tried to hand over the prototype to the Navy Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, but the museum never had any desire to display this unique aircraft that were not actually used by the US Navy. So with no other choices, the Navy made moves to actually scrap the prototype design. This made the engineers at Cole Span hold on to the aircraft until 1995 in the faint hope that someone else would come into power at the Navy and resurrect the program. Unfortunately, that never happened, and finally it was moved to Niagara Aerospace Museum, where it was still there today. A unique aircraft from a unique part of history at rest at last. So why was it never turned into an actual production aircraft? The X-22A was always intended to just be a test airframe and had several flaws in its original design. For one, it never reached the top speed of 525 km per hour or 326 miles per hour that the Navy needed, although it did come very close on a very windy day with 504 km per hour. In addition, the range and lifting capacity of the aircraft seemed weak, and the Navy really couldn't find a role for the aircraft, especially that this prototype would actually require a second design when it would move into actual production. Also, it was rumored that the Navy never really liked the design in the first place, preferring their competing Douglas model that never reached the prototype stage. Perhaps there is a hint here that the powers that be simply decided to park this concept aircraft that landed on their plate. Politics. Another issue with the design was the noise. For a jet engine producing constant level of thrust, it gets louder the smaller the diameter of the propeller gets. For a helicopter with a vast blade spinning around it, it makes a pretty low whooping noise, whilst the small ducted fan on the X-22 would have made a loud roar. In fact, from the time, people near the airport reportedly were bothered by the loud noise of this test aircraft. Any actual production model would actually need to be upgraded with a more stealth design, or the aircraft would not be suitable for combat roles. The enemy would hear it coming. Whilst I call them flaws, you have to keep in mind these were just problems that needed to be tested and figured out, something that the prototype was designed to do. So therefore, it would have been an additional production model that would have actually been the version that the US military would use. With more funding and research required to make the X-22 work, the US military decided it had gone far enough, and that its learnings could be used for a totally radical new design, one that would slowly evolve into the V-22 that we have today, that switched from ducted fans to tilting rotors. But Bell never really gave up on the idea. The idea of an aircraft with 4 ducted fans never really left the back of the firm's mind, and we can see that today with Bell's Nexus Air Taxi design. This electrical powered aircraft has 6 ducted fans and seems a strong contender for the flying car concept. Although the design of the fan seems to show that the airflow would go from the front ducts into the rear ducts and then create a whole bunch of turbulence whilst in flight. Although Bell should hurry, as it turns out that both American Airlines and Virgin Atlantic have both bought the new Vertical Aerospace VAX-4, a flying aircraft that is designed to help commuters fly around cities. So we very well might see them ramp up their designs to stay competitive and bring this concept to market as quickly as possible. And speaking of competitive, if you like this video, then I suggest you check out the story of the first American VTOL aircraft, the CL-346, on this very channel. Or for more helicopter adventurers, I have a long video on my channel about the rise of the rich and luxurious helicopters of Brazil that you can watch right here. But if you're craving aviation news, then pop over to my second channel called Aviation Station, where I'll be doing all sorts of shorter, looser videos as rapidly as possible about all things aviation. So I'll see you over there. This aircraft is unlike any other you have ever seen. It's not a helicopter, and it's not a fighter jet. It's a flying battleship. It would blast away the enemy with firepower that would make helicopters blush, with over 500 grenades, 500 rockets, and multiple recoilless cannons firing into the jungle. Created by the insane minds looking to reinvent combat during the Vietnam War, it would have revolutionized the way we call in air support and potentially made the existing helicopter concept obsolete. But this bonkers aircraft was never actually built, and its legendary design would go down in history as a crazy 1960s fever dream. This is the positively insane, top secret Convair Model 49. At first glance, the Model 49 essentially was half a helicopter, half a fighter jet, and half a battle tank. It was technically considered a shroud-rotored vehicle with two coaxial mounted contra-rotating rotors that were powered by three 3,000 horsepower engines that gave the aircraft flight. Because of this arrangement of the cockpit and the engine system being separated, the entire aircraft could fly vertically like a helicopter, taking off from anywhere, and then rotate horizontally to become a powerful jet. Because of these interrelated systems of lift and thrust, the power was substantial despite the small diameter of these rotors. Of the four nacelles around the shroud, three housed engines and the fourth had weapons and avionics. Convair believed that this could fly very similar to a helicopter, but was more reliable, as it would also use the same principles as a plane for horizontal flight. It was also heavily armoured, with the engines, fuel and crew capsule and avionics bays equipped with dual property steel armour for protection against 12.7mm projectiles, the exact weapons most of the Viet Cong had. And let's talk about that cockpit. The cockpit itself could rotate separately from the rest of the unit and would have two crew members, a pilot, and a weapons officer. The vantage point, plus the suite of modern sensors, including night vision, infrared, and laser targeting, would give it a battlefield commanding position to command troops and blast away the enemy on the ground. And when I tell you all about its guns, you might find yourself blown away as well. I truly don't think you're ready to talk about firepower, really, only because this thing was insane. It had a wide array of weapon options that were proposed for installation on this vehicle, the standard setup comprising of two side turrets, each equipped with either machine guns or 40mm grenade launchers that either had 12,000 rounds or 500 grenades each. In the center turret, there was a XM140 30mm cannon which had 1,000 rounds of ammunition, plus an additional option to include 500 Wasp rockets, or a second 30mm cannon, because why not? Each of these turrets boasted rotational and elevation capabilities, allowing them to be utilized while the vehicle was stationary on the ground, hovering, or cruising at high speeds. To ensure safety, because obviously that was a concern with this insane machine, mechanical stops were in place to prevent it firing towards the front of the crew compartment when it was articulated forward or downward. Furthermore, the vehicle was equipped with 4 hardpoints located on 2 of the engine nacelles. These hardpoints had multiple functionalities, accommodating fuel tanks or 3 missiles for air-to-air combat. Alternatively, 1 hardpoint on each nacelle could support a single 106mm recoilless rifle with 18 rounds of ammunition. The 106mm cannon boasted an effective range of 10,000 yards and was practically adept at engaging hardened targets. So this thing was now a tank hunter. Importantly, all the hardpoints were designed to rotate, enabling orientation into the wind during high-speed flight or aiming while firing from forward flight or hover mode. For extended travel, the vehicle could also have 4 external fuel tanks attached instead, giving an additional 1,200 gallons of fuel capacity for ferry flights, pretty much giving it the range from Los Angeles to Hawaii. Not bad at all. But you want to know how the military would have used this thing in combat? Let's get into the fight. While its original mission was to escort troops into battle, the Model 49 could now do so much more. Taking off vertically with few transports in tow, it would fly ahead of the formation using its superior speed to scout out the landing area. If it encountered enemy aircraft, it could do some limited engagement with its air-to-air missiles, but it would really shine if the enemy was entrenched on the ground. Using what is known as dash mode, it would fire on positions below it without exposing itself to counterattack, strafing along the ground and weakening them for phase 2. Then, it would slow down to a hover, rotating the duct fan vertical and bringing its many weapons to bear onto the enemy. Once it had landed, it could then operate as a secure firing platform, giving the troops on the ground more than a fighting chance. And then once the mission was complete, it would take off yet again and return to base. So if you're anything like me, this sounds pretty damn fantastic, and you're probably wondering, why did the US military even come up with this thing? In the 1960s, Vietnam hit the Army hard, and it taught it several deep lessons, namely the power of support aircraft and the ineffectiveness of ground vehicles in the jungle. Helicopters, essential for dropping supplies and rescuing troops, needed to fly faster, hit harder, and be more resilient in this combat environment. The Army answered this call with the new CH-47A Chinook, able to carry more men, last longer, have a bigger range, and fly faster than any helicopter before. But its speed was a problem. It flew so fast that its protector helicopters couldn't keep up with it. Thus, the Army would need a new escort helicopter. They pitched the idea to develop such an aircraft to the Pentagon and got, well, rejected. You see, the generals in Washington didn't think that the Army needed just an escort helicopter, but rather that they needed to think a little bigger. Why not expand the proposal and come up with an insane new flying machine that could fit many more roles that they were going to spend so much developing? And thus, the Advanced Aerial Fire Support System program was begun. This proposal was simple: combine the power of a helicopter with the firepower of a tank. And this aircraft also needed to be quick, able to fly at a top speed of 220 knots, have the ability to hover at 6,000 feet on a hot day, and ferry itself to the furthest US state, specifically out of the Pacific to Hawaii. This is considerable considering that the Chinook, the original helicopter it was designed to escort, could only fly at 120 knots, so talk about overkill. But that's exactly what the Convair Model 49 was, an idea so out of the box and so radical that Convair believed it would change combat forever. So why was it never built? Now, you're probably looking at this insane thing and starting to wonder, why on earth did it even get this far into development? Upon showing to the selection committee, they nearly laughed Convair out of the room. It was simply overkill, and the design of the aircraft was so radical that they were worried that maintenance issues, or training pilots, would be impossible. There were simply too many points of failure. Plus, the shroud design would have made it slower than a helicopter during takeoff and landing, it would have burnt more fuel, and it would have been loud as heck, giving away its position to the enemy before it came over the hills. They would then go on to choose the Air 66 and the Lockheed CL-840 instead for the program, with the latter being developed into the Lockheed AH-56, but that in turn would be cancelled with its development rolled into the Apache. Now, I'm going to argue why this was a mistake by the US Army. Given Convair's prior experience with tail-sitter VTOL aircraft and relatively straightforward flight and power systems that the Model 49 employed, in contrast to the more helicopter-like offerings from the program, such as the Lockheed hingeless rotor and Sikorsky's translating rotoprop, it would have been more advantageous for the US Army to think creatively and embrace the complex concept rather than being overwhelmed by the complex engineering. Fantastic point highlighted by those nice folks over at Secret Projects. Another consideration that they had was this aircraft's Navy applications. You see, the issue with the current Navy helicopters is space, specifically hangars and landing decks on board ships. The Model 49 solves both of these. A regular Navy helicopter needs to have a big enough space to encompass the spinning rotor with a decent safety margin. Flight decks are usually up to 50 to 70 feet long with the full width of the ship, which is around 50 feet. The Model 49 needs none of this. With its enclosed rotors, it only needs enough space to fit on a 25 by 25 foot area where it can take off. It needs far less safety space because any collision would only be at the very small speeds it would employ during takeoff and landing, compared to the very high speeds of a rotor-tip collision. Plus, the hangars on board could easily fit many more Model 49s. Where normally there are only 2 or 3 helicopters on board a ship, you could fit up to 10 Model 49s, with some ships being able to house nearly 100 units. There are even some thoughts that they could be stationed on submarines, given the small internal volume that they would fill up, which is a totally insane idea. At the end of the day, this concept was superior to the helicopter, but it was too unimaginable to those with the power at the army, and its only result is to appear on this video that you just watched. Thanks for keeping the dream alive, and maybe we'll see it rolled out as some sort of drone variety into the future. I'd love to know what you think down in the comments. I should also point out that a lot of this research was done by Aerospace Projects Review, specifically Dennis R. Jenkins, who put together the original Convair Model 49 Advanced Aerial Fire Support System article in its original publication, so thank you very much for that. Thanks to Star Trek Fleet Command for sponsoring this video. The Borg are back in Star Trek Fleet Command. This is the largest aircraft ever designed. With a wingspan of over 1,000 feet, 500 feet long, nose to tail, and powered by a vast nuclear reactor, this flying aircraft carrier monster is the jet-age equivalent of the Star Trek Enterprise. It can fly around the world without refueling, hover over a city and deploy up to 24 fighter jets, and it even carried 10 nuclear-tipped ICBMs, the ultimate weapon of peace. But who came up with this insane aircraft? Why was it designed? And why was it never built? Today on your favorite aviation channel, we'll be revisiting one of the most nutty aerospace concepts to celebrate 500,000 subscribers. Welcome to the world of the incredible CL-1201. In the 1960s, the American military had a problem. There was a very real chance that they could be cut off from their European allies and their bases around the world, leaving them incredibly isolated in North America. While ships had been the mainstay of deployment overseas for the last 100 years, jet technology had given rise to a bigger, better, and faster form of travel, namely the Boeing 747. Lockheed, always hungry for government contracts and especially jealous of the Boeing 747, took the idea of the plane and essentially ran with it. How big could they actually design an aircraft? The answer is the CL-1201 proposal, which consisted of 3 different aircraft. The CL-1201-1-1 attack aircraft carrier, the CL-1201-2, which I'll get to later, and the CL-1201-1-3 called the logistics support carrier. This design was based on a previous submarine Hunter blended wing body concept that Lockheed was cooking up the year before, and let me know if you'll want to see a video on it down in the comments. With over 2 million cubic meters of internal space, this aerospace concept could easily carry an entire US Army brigade slice in one go to anywhere in the world within hours, an ability that was pretty much like science fiction back in the 1960s. To get some perspective on how big this is, and using that same science fiction metric of the time, Star Trek, this is roughly 10 times more space on board than Kirk's Enterprise, which the Constitution class had around 200,000 meters of cubic space. So this was a ridiculously big aircraft. Ironically, the Enterprise under the next generation would have been twice as big as the CL-1201 at 5 million cubic meters, making this aircraft snugly in between both of them. You can imagine, had this aircraft been built, the captain on board would have felt like a real-life Star Trek fleet commander. But you at home don't have to be in charge to feel that way today, not when we have the fantastic game called Star Trek Fleet Command. In this awesome free game that's on iOS, Android, and Windows, you get to engage in a story-driven Star Trek galaxy with your own fleet of starships and iconic characters from Spock to Data to Michael Burnham. Explore the entire Star Trek universe with real-time combat and mysteries that only you can solve. The Borg are back in new missions inspired by the iconic appearances in Star Trek The Next Generation. Join fan favorite Hugh the Borg and help him stop a scientist's quest for revenge against the Collective. Save an eager Pac-Led from himself as he tries to get the Borg to assimilate him on purpose. Prevent the Borg from assimilating the technology behind your AI assistant, Maya. Plus, all those with starbases can use a cool new feature, assigning well-known Star Trek heroes and villains to oversee strategy from their starbases for increased power and effectiveness in the game. Fleet Commanders launches with 3 choices: Admiral James T. Kirk, Captain Spock, or Locutus of Borg. So if this is right up your alley and you want to customize your dream crew of iconic characters and starships with unique powers to make you stand out as the strongest in the galaxy, then click that link in the description. You'll not only be getting a fun free game that's on Windows, iOS, and Android, but you'll also be supporting the channel and letting me keep making the animations that you love, all 500,000 of you. So with your help, we can warp straight to the next 500,000 subscribers and reach that coveted million milestone. With its internal space, Lockheed would propose 10 to 12 million pounds or 5,440 tons of cargo carrying capacity spread over several decks. And just like Kirk's 5-year mission of exploration, this aircraft would have a capacity to fly for 41 days straight, with 6 decks for crew sleeping, recreation, a mess hall, strategic command, and more, not including the vast cargo bay, 22 times bigger than the Antonov 225. During deployment and flight, any operations to move equipment around would need to be coordinated to prevent the center of gravity shifting too much. And for such a huge plane, conventional fuel wouldn't cut it. And because warp drives haven't been invented yet, this sucker would be nuclear powered, with the reactor system giving out a combined 1.83 gigawatts, allowing this plane to fly for 48 days straight at Mach 0.8 at over 16,000 feet, only having to land because the crew would run out of food and water. The crew, of course, would be 475 personnel, which may go up to 800 during an active combat zone mission. The size required because they would need to maintain operations for over 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The reactor itself wouldn't need to be refueled for over 1,000 operational hours, which roughly comes to around that 40 days mark. Let's discuss the first design, the Attack Aircraft Carrier. It would carry 11 fighter bombers under each wing and 2 more in the fuselage hangars, for a total of 24 aircraft. While we don't know what these final mini-jets would have been, in the documents they're listed as F-4 Phantoms, so perhaps they would have been some sort of parasite fighter, which we know that Lockheed was actually working on around about at the same time. The idea was that this plane would serve as the spearhead of the start of an invasion or a military power projection, and would be the command center for any major military operation. So you can imagine this would have been used extensively in something like Desert Storm. The plane would also carry 10 long-range attack missiles, with Lockheed not ruling out that their warheads would be nuclear tipped. This plane would never land in enemy territory, simply circling the battlefield at 30,000 feet and around 600 miles away. This seems like the same idea as the airborne carrier aircraft that we already covered on the channel, but scaled up by a ridiculous amount. As for going deep behind enemy lines, that was up to its bigger brother, the Dash 3 version, called the Logistic Support Aircraft, or LSA. This version of the plane would be the carrier for the bulk of the mission, bringing in drop troops and other equipment. It would carry 400 troops and 1,100 tons of cargo. But you might be wondering, how did the LSA deploy these troops? After all, it wasn't landing. Well, that's the job of the equally ridiculous medium inter-theater transport planes, essentially converted Boeing 707s that would fly troops and materials back and forth from the LSA whilst it was in the air. The LSA would have a fleet of 5 of these aircraft that would physically dock 3 at a time to the LSA whilst in flight. The planes would approach from the rear and connect to the back of the plane, power down their engines and open the nose through a special airlock. These planes would then fly troops and gear to drop zones for paratrooper operations or land at friendly or captured airports. In addition to the 400 troops on the LSA, there would be 150 troops on each MIT, to a combined power of 1,150 troops in the entire mini fleet. But these aircraft wouldn't actually operate on their own. Yes, that's right, there would be a fleet group of a single attack aircraft carrier and 7, yes that's right, 7 LSA carriers. In total, the combined fleet would carry around 8,050 ground troops, 6,207 tons of equipment, 30 days of food and water, artillery, light aircraft, and attack helicopters, enough for a complete invasion of almost any country in the world. Sounds pretty fantastic, right? So why did the United States never build this insane aircraft? Let's discuss the flaws of the design. First of all, we need to address the elephant in the room. How on earth would this gigantic aircraft take to the skies? After all, with a wingspan so wide and 8 feet wide wheels approximately 200 meters along the wing, the runway itself would need to easily be 650 feet wide, let alone how long it would actually need to cross for it to take off. No such runway exists, and several need to be built for the extra capacity for worldwide operations. But designers thought of this and came up with an honestly pretty genius solution. The aircraft wouldn't take off from a runway at all. It would fly vertically just like a Harrier jet. The LSA would use 54 recently developed turbojet engines from the Boeing 747 to provide over 82,000 pounds of thrust. The aircraft attack version would need a staggering 182 jets to provide vertical lift. Each engine would be in clusters of 20 throughout the plane, with a spine of engines running along each wing. Once the plane got above 16,000 feet, the 4 massive turbojet engines, each with the diameter of a Boeing 747, would power up with the tips going supersonic. If they rotated at around 2,000 rotations per minute, the tips would be moving at over 4,000 feet per second. Such engine technology is almost beyond today's level of technology and would have been an impressive feat for the designers back in 1969. To power all of these engines, the CL-1201 would have a nuclear fission reactor that would provide that necessary amount of electricity for operations on board. although the plane would also carry a small fuel complement as a backup and to ensure that the VTOL capacity worked when needed. To keep the crew safe from radiation during flight, the 30 feet wide reactor core would have 20 feet of radiation protection, adding to the enormous weight. To keep cool, liquid metal would be used to transport the heat to the exterior of the plane, where it would be cooled by the air outside. To prevent radioactive material spilling out during a crash, the reactor was designed to shut down within 20 seconds and could survive a head-on impact with a mountain, traveling at 600 miles an hour without breaking apart. Speaking of impact, the designers also realized that it would be susceptible to missile attacks. Thus, the solution was a laser cannon and point defense systems to blow any rockets out of the sky whilst in flight. But as we don't have many lasers in use today on aircraft, you can kind of see how this idea would have gone. In the end, the CL-1201 project didn't get any further along thanks to its cost, how ridiculous it was, and how exactly the US would need to deploy it. Simply put, it's just completely bonkers. But maybe, and this is the crazy part, maybe a prototype was built. That's right, it's time to pull out the tinfoil and believe in something so crazy sounding that maybe there is a little nugget of the truth. In March of 1997, there was a series of widely sighted UFO objects across Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico, dubbed the Phoenix Lights. Witnesses described the object as flying as a giant V that was bigger than a 747 and sounded like a gushing wind. Despite being nighttime, witnesses saw several lights like those found on aircraft, and the object was huge, that it visibly hit the stars from the sky. Now, I've already covered this exact event here on the channel, and when you start to put it together with a CL-1201, it starts to make sense. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned that there were 3 versions of the CL-1201, but I never went into detail about the second version because it's been scrubbed from history. It's highly possible that this second version was to be some sort of spy platform, some sort of massive installation that could fly around the world before the invention of spy satellites and be used to spy anywhere at any time. And perhaps it incorporated rudimentary stealth technology that back then would make it not able to be detected by radar. Special thanks to Scott from Aerospace Projects Review, who helped with the research for the original video and his continuous help in the channel so far. You are a legend, just like the other 500,000 people that have watched this channel. Deep Space Nine is arriving in Star Trek Fleet Command, and Star Trek Fleet Command is available on iOS, Android, and Windows. Download now using my link below or by scanning the QR code to join the fight. I really do want to say thanks so much to sponsors like these, like Star Trek Fleet Command, and those people that check them out. You are the people that are powering the channel forward, and I can't wait to see where we go next. And if you enjoyed today's content and you're new to the channel, it's time for you to click subscribe and check out the many other videos right here. Thanks again so much for watching, guys, and I actually am going off script here right at the end of the video because I've finished now, and I just want to say, man, 500,000, that's completely crazy. And if you're one of the people seeing this before the 500,000 milestone's been reached, well then you're a little bit extra special. Thanks for watching. This is the largest aircraft ever designed. With a wingspan of over 1,000 feet, 500 feet long, nose to tail, and powered by a vast nuclear reactor, this flying aircraft carrier monster is the jet-age equivalent of the Star Trek Enterprise. It can fly around the world without refueling, hover over a city and deploy up to 24 fighter jets, and it even carried 10 nuclear-tipped ICBMs, the ultimate weapon of peace. But who came up with this insane aircraft? Why was it designed? And why was it never built? Today on your favorite aviation channel, we'll be revisiting one of the most nutty aerospace concepts to celebrate 500,000 subscribers. Welcome to the world of the incredible CL-1201. In the 1960s, the American military had a problem. There was a very real chance that they could be cut off from their European allies and their bases around the world, leaving them incredibly isolated in North America. While ships had been the mainstay of deployment overseas for the last 100 years, jet technology had given rise to a bigger, better, and faster form of travel, namely the Boeing 747. Lockheed, always hungry for government contracts and especially jealous of the Boeing 747, took the idea of the plane and essentially ran with it. How big could they actually design an aircraft? The answer is the CL-1201 proposal, which consisted of 3 different aircraft. The CL-1201-1-1 attack aircraft carrier, the CL-1201-2, which I'll get to later, and the CL-1201-1-3 called the logistics support carrier. This design was based on a previous submarine Hunter blended wing body concept that Lockheed was cooking up the year before, and let me know if you'll want to see a video on it down in the comments. With over 2 million cubic meters of internal space, this aerospace concept could easily carry an entire US Army brigade slice in one go to anywhere in the world within hours, an ability that was pretty much like science fiction back in the 1960s. To get some perspective on how big this is, and using that same science fiction metric of the time, Star Trek, this is roughly 10 times more space on board than Kirk's Enterprise, which the Constitution class had around 200,000 meters of cubic space. So this was a ridiculously big aircraft. Ironically, the Enterprise under the next generation would have been twice as big as the CL-1201 at 5 million cubic meters, making this aircraft snugly in between both of them. You can imagine, had this aircraft been built, the captain on board would have felt like a real-life Star Trek fleet commander. With its internal space, Lockheed would propose 10 to 12 million pounds or 5,440 tons of cargo carrying capacity spread over several decks. And just like Kirk's 5-year mission of exploration, this aircraft would have a capacity to fly for 41 days straight, with 6 decks for crew sleeping, recreation, a mess hall, strategic command, and more, not including the vast cargo bay, 22 times bigger than the Antonov 225. During deployment and flight, any operations to move equipment around would need to be coordinated to prevent the center of gravity shifting too much. And for such a huge plane, conventional fuel wouldn't cut it. And because warp drives haven't been invented yet, this sucker would be nuclear powered, with the reactor system giving out a combined 1.83 gigawatts, allowing this plane to fly for 48 days straight at Mach 0.8 at over 16,000 feet, only having to land because the crew would run out of food and water. The crew, of course, would be 475 personnel, which may go up to 800 during an active combat zone mission. The size required because they would need to maintain operations for over 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The reactor itself wouldn't need to be refueled for over 1,000 operational hours, which roughly comes to around that 40 days mark. Let's discuss the first design, the attack aircraft carrier. It would carry 11 fighter bombers under each wing and 2 more in the fuselage hangars for a total of 24 aircraft. While we don't know what these final mini-jets would have been, in the documents they're listed as F-4 Phantoms, so perhaps they would have been some sort of parasite fighter, which we know that Lockheed was actually working on around about at the same time. The idea was that this plane would serve as the spearhead of the start of an invasion or a military power projection, and would be the command center for any major military operation. So you can imagine this would have been used extensively in something like Desert Storm. The plane would also carry 10 long-range attack missiles, with Lockheed not ruling out that their warheads would be nuclear-tipped. This plane would never land in enemy territory, simply circling the battlefield at 30,000 feet and around 600 miles away. This seems like the same idea as the airborne carrier aircraft that we already covered on the channel, but scaled up by a ridiculous amount. As for going deep behind enemy lines, that was up to its bigger brother, the Dash 3 version, called the Logistic Support Aircraft, or LSA. This version of the plane would be the carrier for the bulk of the mission, bringing in drop troops and other equipment. It would carry 400 troops and 1,100 tons of cargo. But you might be wondering, how did the LSA deploy these troops? After all, it wasn't landing. Well, that's the job of the equally ridiculous medium inter-theater transport planes, essentially converted Boeing 707s that would fly troops and materials back and forth from the LSA whilst it was in the air. The LSA would have a fleet of 5 of these aircraft that would physically dock 3 at a time to the LSA whilst in flight. The planes would approach from the rear and connect to the back of the plane, power down their engines, and open the nose through a special airlock. These planes would then fly troops and gear to drop zones for paratrooper operations or land at friendly or captured airports. In addition to the 400 troops on the LSA, there would be 150 troops on each MIT, to a combined power of 1,150 troops in the entire mini fleet. But these aircraft wouldn't actually operate on their own. Yes, that's right, there would be a fleet group of a single attack aircraft carrier and 7, yes that's right, 7 LSA carriers. In total, the combined fleet would carry around 8,050 ground troops, 6,207 tons of equipment, 30 days of food and water, artillery, light aircraft, and attack helicopters, enough for a complete invasion of almost any country in the world. Sounds pretty fantastic, right? So, why did the United States never build this insane aircraft? Let's discuss the flaws of the design. First of all, we need to address the elephant in the room. How on earth would this gigantic aircraft take to the skies? After all, with a wingspan so wide and 8 feet wide wheels approximately 200 meters along the wing, the runway itself would need to easily be 650 feet wide, let alone how long it would actually need to cross for it to take off. No such runway exists, and several need to be built for the extra capacity for worldwide operations. But designers thought of this and came up with an honestly pretty genius solution. The aircraft wouldn't take off from a runway at all. It would fly vertically just like a Harrier jet. The LSA would use 54 recently developed turbojet engines from the Boeing 747 to provide over 82,000 pounds of thrust. The aircraft attack version would need a staggering 182 jets to provide vertical lift. Each engine would be in clusters of 20 throughout the plane, with a spine of engines running along each wing. Once the plane got above 16,000 feet, the 4 massive turbojet engines, each with the diameter of a Boeing 747, would power up with the tips going supersonic. If they rotated at around 2,000 rotations per minute, the tips would be moving at over 4,000 feet per second. Such engine technology is almost beyond today's level of technology and would have been an impressive feat for the designers back in 1969. To power all of these engines, the CL-1201 would have a nuclear fission reactor that would provide that necessary amount of electricity for operations on board. Although the plane would also carry a small fuel complement as a backup and to ensure that the VTOL capacity worked when needed. To keep the crew safe from radiation during flight, the 30 feet wide reactor core would have 20 feet of radiation protection, adding to the enormous weight. To keep cool, liquid metal would be used to transport the heat to the exterior of the plane, where it would be cooled by the air outside. To prevent radioactive material spilling out during a crash, the reactor was designed to shut down within 20 seconds and could survive a head-on impact with a mountain, traveling at 600 miles an hour without breaking apart. Speaking of impact, the designers also realized that it would be susceptible to missile attacks. Thus, the solution was a laser cannon and point defense systems to blow any rockets out of the sky whilst in flight. But as we don't have many lasers in use today on aircraft, you can kind of see how this idea would have gone. In the end, the CL-1201 project didn't get any further along thanks to its cost, how ridiculous it was, and how exactly the US would need to deploy it. Simply put, it's just completely bonkers. But maybe, and this is the crazy part, maybe a prototype was built. That's right, it's time to pull out the tinfoil and believe in something so crazy sounding that maybe there is a little nugget of the truth. In March of 1997, there was a series of widely sighted UFO objects across Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico dubbed the Phoenix Lights. Witnesses described the object as flying as a giant V that was bigger than a 747 and sounded like a gushing wind. Despite being nighttime, witnesses saw several lights like those found on aircraft, and the object was huge, that it visibly hit the stars from the sky. Now, I've already covered this exact event here on the channel, and when you start to put it together with a CL1201, it starts to make sense. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned that there were 3 versions of the CL1201, but I never went into detail about the second version because it's been scrubbed from history. It's highly possible that this second version was to be some sort of spy platform, some sort of massive installation that could fly around the world before the invention of spy satellites and be used to spy anywhere at any time. And perhaps it incorporated rudimentary stealth technology that back then would make it not able to be detected by radar.